Thank you. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jackie Andrade, who's Professor of Psychology at Plymouth. She's one of the key developers of functional imagery training, which is, I believe, a focus of the current talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. And essentially what I'm going to be talking about is how we mentally represent those future goals and temptations that Professor Rowe was talking about. So I'm going to start with a story about everyday temptation and impulsivity that hopefully rings some bells for some of you. So a few weeks ago, I'm sitting at my desk in my office writing this talk. It's 10 o'clock in the morning. I had breakfast, but I'm a bit stuck. I'm not sure what I'm going to put on the next slide. And I remember that in the filing cabinet where I used to keep my photocopies of papers before they were digitized, there's a pack of chocolate biscuits. And once I start thinking about the biscuits, I realize that I actually need to eat a biscuit before I can continue with my talk. Okay? I'd put to you that this is not a physiological, visceral urge that I'm having to exert willpower to control. It's 10 o'clock in the morning. I'm not hungry. Also, if you were to wave biscuits in front of me now, even though I didn't have one at the break, I'm not going to suddenly crave a biscuit because my head is full of what I'm going to say next. Has anybody left yet? Am I making any sense? I'm not going to be thinking about biscuits. But also we get this type of goal conflict for other sorts of things. It's not just about hunger and appetite and physiology and conditioned drug withdrawal and so on. I get the same problem when I want to stay at work to finish my talk because it's important, it's going to be embarrassing standing up here without any slides. But I also want to leave work early and go and do things I enjoy with my family. They're both equally important. So thinking about my motivation in terms of what I care most about doesn't really work either. Okay, so I was asked to talk about impulsivity, which isn't something I typically measure in my research, so I thought I should at least have a slide on it. I'm going to talk more about motivation and temptation because this work stems on the research we were doing on drug cravings. So, yeah, if you think of addiction as problems with impulsivity because you tend to respond to cravings rather than sustaining your long-term goal of quitting. So that's the sort of sphere I'm going to be talking about. But I'm going to try and persuade you that temptations involve mental imagery. That is how we represent what it would be like to do particular behaviors. Motivation for long-term goals does exactly the same. So we should be looking at models that combine both motivation and impulsivity. And I'll suggest that we can think of willpower, which I don't believe is a thing in terms of personality, but it's the ability to shift attention using goal imagery from an immediate temptation to the broader context that you're operating in. And we can train this ability. So, first point to illustrate that cravings involve cognitive processes, not merely physiological ones. Lotte van Dillen ran a study where she approached people on the commuter train in Amsterdam as they were coming home from work. It was around supper time, and she gave them a menu written in typically kind of flowery restaurant language, describing how delicious all these meals would be. And she asked people to spend a couple of minutes choosing which they would like to eat if they had the option. And then they either spent a few minutes copying out which options they'd chosen, or they did some word puzzles. What she found was that the people who merely copied out what they were going to eat had reported high levels of craving, and when they were offered a reward for taking part in the study, were more likely to choose a sweet rather than a pen. The people who had the cognitive distraction reported lower cravings and were more likely to choose a pen rather than something edible as the reward. So something is happening here that involves cognitive processes. And we wanted to know what sort of cognition was most important. Was it merely thinking in some verbal terms about a word puzzle versus what you were going to eat? And our answer was no. The critical thing for most people is mental imagery, because that is how we represent how it feels to do certain behaviours, and not merely the facts of doing those behaviours. So, for example, a study we published recently, we asked people to remember emotional personal events from their lives, and either to do that silently, making the memory as vivid as possible, or to do it by telling us what the memory was about, what had happened. And what we found was that people rated their memories as much more distressing or much happier if they were silently imagining them than if they were narrating them to a listener. The other thing we know about imagery is it requires limited capacity working memory processes. So that potentially gives us a way of controlling impulsivity and motivation. So we wove these sort of starting assumptions into a theory initially of drug cravings, but it was always intended to be a theory of desire in general, which we called the elaborated intrusion theory because it involved intrusive thoughts that could be elaborated, and it was that elaboration that really is what's going on when we experience a desire for a drug or for a long-term goal. So I'll just go through elaborated intrusion theory quite briefly. All these things around the edge are things that trigger a craving. They're often the focus for a lot of research on cravings and addiction, but in our theory, they are merely the gateway to an episode of craving. What they do is increase the likelihood that you have what feels like a spontaneous thought about the substance. So you suddenly think, I haven't had any chocolate recently, I need some chocolate, or it's time I had a cigarette. And when we ask people when they're in the middle of a craving episode what triggered their craving, the most common answer is, I don't know, I spontaneously thought about it. But even in samples of people who are awaiting treatment for alcohol use disorder, these spontaneous thoughts can come and go without apparent effort. So they don't inevitably lead you to experience a desire for the substance. What happens when you do experience desire is that you start elaborating that thought. So you might think, have I got time to nip out and have a cigarette? Do I have money to buy some food? But most importantly, you start imagining what it would be like. So if the thing that got you started was noticing your stomach's rumbling and you're feeling a bit hungry, you might think, I need some food. But then imagining eating and not feeling hungry anymore makes you realize that you currently are quite hungry, and you start thinking, what would reduce that hunger? So maybe you think about the chocolate biscuit, or you think about eating some pizza. And the more specific that becomes, the more vividly you can imagine how good it would be to bite into the pizza, what it would taste like, what it would smell like, maybe what it would feel like as you picked it up in your fingers. And also how good it would feel to have satisfied that hunger. Okay. So the image that you conjure up, the more vivid and specific it becomes, the more it acts as a standard against which you can compare your current deficit. And my deficit is no longer that I'm a bit hungry, it's that I need pizza and I haven't had pizza. So it becomes increasingly specific, and that drives you to go and buy some pizza or to smoke your cigarette or whatever. Now, we have various sorts of evidence for elaborated intrusion theory. For instance, when we ask people what their cravings are like, whether they're people with addictions waiting for treatment or members of the general public, people tell us that they involve multisensory imagery. We've particularly focused on visual imagery because that's common to cravings for all sorts of substances. Other types of imagery, whether it's smell or taste, or the feel, for instance, of swallowing your favourite type of alcohol, those types vary in importance. But visual imagery is nearly always relevant. Not surprisingly, we're very visual creatures. And so what we find is that visual imagery is pretty strongly correlated with strength of desire to eat or drink or smoke. And there seems to be consistent correlations across multiple studies between the frequency and the strength with which people experience imagery and their desire to indulge in whatever was tempting them. It's not just about things that we can swallow and inhale, though. It's also about behaviours. So a really nice study by Victor Monson compared in qualitative and quantitative data people with gambling disorder and people with alcohol use disorder, and found that in both cases there were many reports of vivid multisensory imagery. And I think what was really interesting, there were also reports of verbal thinking, but they tended to be much colder, much more rational. So this example, somebody saying, I've had conferences with myself, I've tried to talk sense to myself. It doesn't have that emotional power that the imagery of imagining the big win on the jackpot machine has for you. Okay. So you might argue that these are all quite correlational data, or maybe imagery is just epiphenomenal. What supports the idea that imagery is actually causal in our drive to do different behaviours comes from experimental studies. So this one by my colleague John May. These were smokers who'd abstained from smoking before coming into the lab. We usually find in this situation, even in a short study, their cravings increase while they're in the lab because we take their cigarettes away from them and we say, it'll be fine, you can smoke as soon as you leave. And just that is enough to get people thinking about how good it would be to smoke and how long is this going to go on for. When we give people an auditory task to do, we see their craving increasing. It's not doing anything to the imagery, the sensory imagery that is driving the craving. But craving either goes down or stays roughly level when we give them a visual spatial task to do that blocks the visual imagery that's helping to support the craving. So imagery seems to be playing a causal role in temptation. The good news is it seems to do the same thing with more functional desires. So we see the same correlations between desire and imagery when we look at people's desire to do sport, to kind of make sustainable changes to their behaviour, to engage in different self-care behaviours in type 1 diabetes, for instance. And just to keep on the theme of addiction here, this was a study by David Kavanagh in Brisbane showing that the frequency or the strength with which you imagine how good it would be to reduce your alcohol consumption and how you would set about doing that successfully, those types of imagery are positively associated with readiness to change, being in the contemplation phase or even the taking action phase of reducing alcohol consumption. So, we were excited by the possibility, based on these ideas, that we could actually create cravings, stronger desires for healthy activities. But to do that, we need to change our model, because elaborate intrusion theory only focuses on one type of desire at a time. And I'd argue that this is a problem with an awful lot of research that puts people in a situation where they're just focusing on one behaviour or one temptation. But most of the time we've got a multitude of things pulling on us, telling us to do this behaviour or do that behaviour. So this is our effective imagery theory of motivation. We haven't published it yet, but it is essentially two versions of elaborate intrusion theory, simplified so we can fit them side by side on one side. So we've got one cycle here for my motivation to eat a chocolate biscuit. We've got another cycle here for my motivation to finish writing my talk. Okay? There might be shared triggers, and there'll be individual triggers. So noticing that I'm a bit hungry might trigger me to think about eating the biscuit. But looking at the clock and thinking, it's 10 o'clock, might make me think, oh, it's only an hour to go before I can justify stopping for a coffee and biscuit. Or I might think, it's 10 o'clock already, I've only done 2 slides, I'd better get a move on. So one trigger might stimulate both cycles in this model. It might make me aware of a deficit, that I haven't made much progress with the talk, that I haven't eaten anything for an hour, or it might make me aware that biscuits are nice, finishing my talk would be good. Either way, I'm going to start imagining what it would be like to make some progress on my talk, or what it would be like to eat a chocolate biscuit. And the more I do that, the more I'm aware of my current chocolate-free state. And that prompts further elaboration to imagine what I could do to address that deficit. Okay? So it becomes increasingly specific. It's not just eating anything or any chocolate biscuit, it's eating that specific biscuit that is sitting there tempting me in my filing cabinet. Okay. And whichever one attracts the most cognitive resources, which, if you remember, have limited capacity, is going to wrest control of behavior. Okay. So it's about how we make decisions when we have a conflict between different behaviors that we could attempt. And you probably guess what comes next. I'm stuck with my talk. I don't know how it's going to end. It's really hard to imagine actually making progress with that, whereas I'm very practiced at imagining how nice chocolate biscuits taste. Okay. So in this model, motivation is a fluctuating state. It's influenced by competing goals and temptations. And we can see this from research, for instance, McLean's study, where people were asked moment to moment to report on their desire to smoke and how much they valued health. And what they found was that the higher smokers' cravings for a cigarette were, the less value they placed on health. In other words, the less motivated they felt at that moment to stay healthy. So in this model, I see impulsivity as that motivational balance being shifted towards shorter-term goals. But they're still goals. They're not some magic temptation that operates outside this system. I'd argue we don't have a bit of the brain specifically for drug cravings. It's the part of the brain we use to stay focused on goals in general. Okay. Some evidence for this comes from studies of delay discounting tasks, which have been mentioned by previous speakers. If we get people to imagine something they're going to be doing in the near future, that pushes them to be more likely to take the bigger, longer-term reward that they're going to get in the future, rather than opt impulsively for the immediate short-term reward. And we also know that the vividness with which people can imagine that future state is predictive of their likelihood to wait for the future bigger reward. And that in turn is linked with activation not just in prefrontal cortex, but activation in a network linking prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and limbic areas, which I think is at least consistent with the idea that what we're doing is representing the emotion that we would feel if we went for one reward rather than another. So the clinical implications are that we shouldn't just look at trying to reduce impulsivity. We should look at the bigger motivational picture and think about what would happen if we increased motivation for those longer-term goals. That would inevitably reduce motivation for the short-term reward, because we have limited capacity to do both types of cognition at once. It also means that we should be looking at imagery-based interventions rather than just verbal dialogue. And that we should also be using imagery to build self-efficacy, because we're not going to be motivated to do things that we don't believe we can achieve. So I might have a desire to marry a prince, but unless I have some strategy for how I'm going to go about that, unless I have the right, I don't know, social connections or levels of beauty or whatever is going to achieve this goal, it's a daydream. It's not an actual motivation that's linked with any sort of behaviour. So we need to build self-efficacy as well. And we need to support positive motivations rather than cure negative ones. And I've already said that we should focus on the positive goals rather than simply on the problematic impulses. But we should also focus on doing things people will enjoy and want to achieve rather than just getting them to stop doing things because they're unhealthy. Because in this system, we want people to be imagining the positive behaviours and how they're going to achieve their positive goals. We don't like imagining negative things. So thinking, I'd better not eat that biscuit because, you know, I'll put on weight if I do that. It's easier just not to think that and have the biscuit. Whereas if I think, I'm not going to eat that biscuit because as soon as I finish this talk, I'm going to go and do something I really love doing, I'm much more likely to dwell on those thoughts and imagine them vividly. Okay. And the other good news, we can teach people to do this. I have no idea what time I've got. 2 more minutes. Okay, I'm going to say this bit really fast then. Okay, so functional imagery training is effectively motivational interviewing, so a person-centered verbal intervention where we add imagery to build motivation, build self-efficacy, and then we teach people to do it for themselves. So at the end of a functional imagery training intervention, the person will have a vivid image that starts with what they're going to do today to work towards their goal, moves forward in the future to how good it will feel to have been taking those steps for a few days or weeks, to how good it will feel to achieve their goal, and noticing in their image what other things are better as a result. And then we teach people to do that by linking imagery with everyday behaviour. So maybe, you know, every time you pick up a bottle of water or a glass, then just quickly bring that image to mind so that it's there when you imagine, oh, chopped biscuit, those are nice, I can imagine how nice those would taste. You've also got that image of, no, I'm going to move on because there's something I really want to do next. So I'm going to skip the demo and just quickly present some data that this seems to be effective in different conditions. So this was a randomized controlled trial on weight loss. People had 4 hours of individual intervention with functional imagery training or motivational interviewing, spread over 6 months, so very light touch intervention, then 6 months with no contact. And what we find is that in the motivational interviewing condition, people lost a little under 1 kilo in weight and kept that off, which is consistent with meta-analyses of MI for weight loss. In the functional imagery training condition, people lost about 4.5 kilos in the first 6 months, and the holy grail part really was that they kept losing on average another 2 kilos in the 6 months unsupported. So just very quickly, we can use those probabilities that we've already observed to do some Bayesian modelling of how many people, new people who received these interventions would be likely to lose weight. And around 55% would lose weight if they received motivational interviewing. Around 94% of people would lose weight if they received functional imagery training. People also enjoyed being asked to keep imagining positive outcomes for themselves, which made us think about mental health conditions and the temptations to do nothing, to stay safe, to have some immediate pleasure because you feel so awful that you want something now to boost your mood, versus the willpower situations that might be better for your mental health. So we've tested fit against waitlist. These are just student studies, and found benefits for anxiety reduction, slightly bigger benefits compared with motivational interviewing for anxiety reduction, and some really positive qualitative feedback as well. Similarly, really small studies, but with depression, suggesting that we can reduce depression symptoms, and that people experience this as giving them a bit of control and a bit of direction when they feel completely overwhelmed by their feelings and the situation they're in. So to conclude, we can reduce impulsivity by using imagery to strengthen desire for a longer-term goal, or a goal that is in opposition to whatever temptation you're facing. And we can use imagery to build self-efficacy. And we can teach people not only to bring these images to mind readily, but also to switch their attention from the temptation image to the goal image, which also gives you that belief that you can control the cravings when they happen. Okay, that's all I've got for you. Thank you very much.
Much for that interesting talk. Unfortunately, just got time for one question. That hand shot up right there. So we will take roving mic on its way.
It shot up really fast, didn't it?
Yeah.
It's a good talk. What's the difference between this training and self-hypnosis?
I've never worked with self-hypnosis, but one of the things that happens here is that you have that dialogue with another person, which often leads you to insights that you don't have when you're just thinking about that yourself. And I know this from experience of training students in functional imagery training, and finding that I've seemingly magically solved my own problem when I should know perfectly well how to use this technique on myself. So I think it's very different having that dialogue with somebody else, but then being trained in the imagery and having somebody else refine that imagery with you, so that you get a sense of which bits are really motivating. You might not have had insight into when you're doing it for yourself.
Sorry, that was my question. When you do train for self-hypnosis, somebody goes through the imagery with you and makes a real virtual reality in your mind. So that's why I thought there was some overlaps there.
Yeah, it sounds like there is.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So that concludes the impulsivity session.